Yeah, unless they want to give some text.
Sorry, that's a whole other discussion.
Hey, you asked for this.
Yeah.
This is what you get.
Everybody trying to cover their rump. I was alive then, I don't remember it.
No, you're supposed to say this is what made you an historian. This is what made you.
Sorry about that.
Sorry, you cut that part. Don't include I don't know.
Thank you.
So everyone, here we have a 1776 edition of Common Sense by Thomas Paine. And I'd love to hear what you all think about it.
Well, the first thing I think about it is I wish I'd have written this because it sold in the hundreds of thousands. I mean, this was the most popular pamphlet of its day. These things didn't just appear on a computer screen because they didn't have them. These had to be mailed and circulated, and that information took a long time to get around.
Here was a document that was not in the periodic style of the Declaration of Independence, which you have to be educated to read. Paine is a master of the laconic style, which you can read aloud right off the page, and it has full rhetorical impact.
So he has lines in there where he says, like, there's something ridiculous in the nature of monarchy, right? This idea that human beings can be naturally better than other human beings, right? It's a very small R Republican document, more so in ways that are more striking, I think, than other patriot literature of the time.
And is that ultimately a conversation about slavery, right? Not just enslaved people, but the enslavement of the colonies by a ruling class. Is that what's going on here with the small R Republican?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think Paine, like other patriots, is raising the question of like what ultimately in nature or in the universe does slavery rest on? Does it have any kind of like natural basis, right? Because he's all about like how do governments actually emerge from nature? And so is there something immovable or inherent about slavery, or is it too as ridiculous as monarchy? What appears contradictory to us, but I don't think was contradictory to settler colonizers at the time, that a war for your liberty could at the same time be a war to maintain slavery and kind of settlement on Indian land and things of that nature.
Okay, so the next document we have here is a muster roll from Francis Marion. And I'm just going to slide that to the center there, but feel free to move it back and forth if you want and take a closer look at how they've recorded this. It's from 1778 for context.
You know, we tend to think of the Swamp Fox and his hardy band of partisans as a kind of ad hoc group that is engaged in improvisational warfare and spontaneous genius actions, but here this is a very orderly document, and the hierarchy of rank and function is laid out in a way. These aren't a band of improvisers at all. This is people with a sense of regularity and military order who are engaged in this.
Not some ramshackle, grabbing people from the countryside, will you fight for the revolution? No, this is something really fundamental. I mean, look at this here. We have, how long was he away for? For what time was he absent? Sick in town. This is a precise calculation of bodies, right? Because you need the bodies to fight. And without this kind of organization, it wouldn't have mattered if the French had come on or not. Without this, it probably wouldn't have worked.
My favorite of his subordinates is not on this document. Hezekiah Mayhem, who becomes a kind of folk hero and a personality whom the great novelist William Gilmore Simms bases his 6 Revolutionary War novels on Captain Porgy, a bumptious, large Falstaffian landowner. And interestingly enough, he is the man who introduces Carolina gold rice into cultivation in our state. So a figure of more than little historical interest.
Can I say I'm just so excited to watch you all go through this document and read it with such a fine-tooth comb. So much comes out of one source. That's just one, right? And so I'm thinking about, how do you all connect with students where history has been nothing but names and dates for them for years? How could you bring this into the classroom that will kind of help them rediscover their love for history?
I mean, I would go back to the actual making of the document, right? So where was this written? What was the lighting like? How comfortable was it to write this? How much time did it take to do these lines? This is not in some fancy library. This is not in some comfortable environment. This is probably by candlelight, if it's at night, on some cramped desk. And the precision, I would have them measure how equal are those lines. And I'm looking at it now and I think they're pretty equal. There is care here, there is precision, and behind that care and precision resides determination.
Right. Now, what's interesting too to think about, we know that Francis Marion was not the person who did this.
Right.
There was an adjunct who did it, and he signed it at the end. Indeed, you can tell from the pressure of the ink here that it's different than the light and sort of considered hand of the person who's laying out the names and numbers here. Is the guy's name on this paper?
No.
Yes.
Right. Great point, great point.
All right, so this is our first post-war document. It's quasi-loyalist. It's to the Honorable John Lloyd, Esquire, President, and to the members of the Senate of South Carolina on behalf of James Castle, who had a commission of colonel in this district under the British general. And basically, he's trying to explain his position as a loyalist and someone who is fighting for the British, and the fact that those sentiments perhaps weren't as sincere, and that he was in fact helping the Americans by restraining the British during his time under the British service.
Yes, so he's trying to get out from under the Confiscation Act, which was passed in February 1782, which confiscated Loyalist property and distributed some of it as bounty to soldiers, and then also just auctioned it off in mass.
I mean, these are kind of typical, in some sense, aftermath of war documents, right? You find this after the Civil War too, which people say, well, I really wasn't fighting for the Confederacy. I was strong-armed into doing it. This is what he's doing here, right? I mean, if you look at what he says, it's pretty outrageous. Frequent instances afforded them protection from the violence and plundering of the British officers and soldiery. In other words, I was there trying to protect them, even though I was a colonel in the British Army.
Everybody trying to cover their rump.
That's right. There you go.
At every age.
That's right. He's a bad loyalist, basically, isn't he? I mean, really.
Bad to the bone.
Especially when I am working with K through 12 students, as I'm working with students here at the university. I think the most interesting part is watching them pick up a document and that light bulb goes off. One, that we still have access to it. Why do we still have access to it? Maybe they're struggling to read through the penmanship, cursive or in print, but it's the think, pair, share at that table, to be able to put their ideas out there together, whether right or wrong, because I really try to create a safe space that really lends to healthy dialogic communication. And I think that's the most important part when you're looking at those materials, whether you agree or not, but that there's value amongst all the minds at the table.
When these young people see these documents, and it looks like something alien to them because it is cursive, right? It's cursive.
Yeah.
And they're probably not taught cursive in school very much at all, right?
No.
How long does it take them to look at it and then begin to unpack the cursive meaning? like begin to read it for understanding?
It takes a couple of class sessions. And so sometimes I will have cursive letters out on the table so students can read through those. I will go and read for myself openly in the class. And students aren't embarrassed because they recognize their peers. They don't know it either. The first time I looked through Sumter's papers, I was struggling. And I was like, I know I can read this. It takes a couple of sessions.
It's not easy. And that's kind of the lesson here, isn't it? It's not easy, and it shouldn't be, right? These are important documents that have bequeathed us some fundamental values, and they require a bit of work. That in itself, I think, is the kind of legacy of the Declaration of Independence. Right?
That's such a good point, that it should take work to understand the American Revolution. One last thing about the Confiscation Act. It takes a lot of twists and turns in South Carolina. For enslaved people, though, the Confiscation Act is pretty devastating because it places them up for two things: mass public auction, some of which are held in Charleston. Other auctions of confiscated slaves are held in Camden because they're trying to attract backcountry buyers with confiscated slaves. The other aspect of confiscation for enslaved people is that South Carolina pays soldiers a bounty in, the exact language is 1 sound Negro, ages 10 to 40. They pay out slaves as an enlistment bounty to men who will enlist in the Continental Army in 1782. And so literally, the Confiscation Act is part of a broader series of policies that's actually making slaveholders out of people who previously, before the Revolution, didn't own slaves. It's actually spreading slaveholding.
What we have next are excerpts from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. We're 100 years later, we're looking at the centennial, the first centennial of the Revolution, but it also happens to coincide with the end of Reconstruction. And of course, that's a very contentious and violent time in South Carolina's history.
I love the color. I love the color. And I think I like to see the lines in work. Again, we were talking about the signature earlier, how the pen is held, the pressure points on the signature itself, but you can kind of see that in the art.
There are a number of things I think about in connection with this, the national versus the South Carolina story. The Centennial Exposition takes place in Philadelphia. It's the first place that has a restaurant that is designated as a Southern restaurant. Southern food doesn't exist as a category until the Centennial. And it makes sense because the South itself thought it's of states. You know, it's Virginia food, South Carolina food. But it's in the Reconstruction that all of a sudden you have this creation of this composite identity, which is, strangely enough, put in tension with a national story.
So one of the points that historians make about the Civil War is that you've got these significant immigrant populations that had come in the 1840s and 1850s to the North. And the Union Army, the experience of warfare and war making, made them American, right? The Revolutionary War did a similar thing, if you think about it, because they weren't American. There was no such thing as America.
Yeah, there's been great work done on the Continental Army as a kind of nation-making institution, right? That one, it's not just bringing people from different states together in kind of a common formation, but it's also taking in lots of immigrants, including immigration by desertion from the British and Hessians, right? That the Continental Army is polylingual. It's ethnically mixed. It's where Germans and Scots and English and American-born colonists are all serving side by side. And so it's a kind of nation-making institution.
Let me ask you a question about this, since we're now traversing 100 years, right? And I've got these bright minds around me. I'm kind of curious. Let's imagine for just a moment that the American Revolution had turned in favor of the British. So that Declaration of Independence was just a rhetorical posture. They lost the war, it's still British. What would this look like? What would this century look like if the Americans had lost?
It's, at least on like my subject expertise, the history of slavery, it's really hard to say what slavery would look like without the Revolution, because Britain does abolish slavery before the United States does.
The 1830s.
Right. But part of the reason it's able to do that is that the revolution like halves out like half of its slave colonies, right? And so the West Indies are a little more isolated after than they were before. And so would being part of the British Empire have kept North America on like an 1830s timetable for abolition? Maybe, maybe not. It's unclear.
It could have been the opposite, right?
Yes.
Because it was so profitable.
Yeah.
One of the reasons the British could afford to abolish slavery in the earlier 1830s is because it wasn't that profitable, or rather it was costing them.
Yes.
But if you'd have kept the South, and of course the American Revolution could have easily turned into not keeping the entire North American continent, but just the southern colonies, right? Which was, in fact, a war aimed towards the end, right?
Yes.
So what would have happened had the South remained part of the British Empire? I think slavery would have not been abolished in the 1830s. It would have gone on far beyond the 1860s and probably followed that Brazilian model to the 1880s, right? So this would not have happened at all.
I'm going to be thinking about that after this. That's fascinating. I don't like the dark places that takes me.
Okay, so we're ending with a piece of ephemera. We're going to jump ahead to the bicentennial 1976. This is a commemorative program from the American Freedom Train. This brings up another sort of question. We're 200 years later, and now instead of being in the wake of Reconstruction and sort of the failed attempt of Reconstruction, we're in the wake of Vietnam and the Watergate scandal. Gerald Ford, who is president at the time, is trying to bring the nation together in optimism and positivity, and they had this mobile museum basically on the Freedom Train that they drove around the nation.
I was alive then, I don't remember it. Obviously, its effects were not as potent as they had wished.
I mean, why a train? That's kind of interesting to me, right? I'd have to read it in some detail here, but plainly this is one of those things that I kind of started with the nostalgia of the Declaration of Independence, the nostalgia of the Revolutionary War, because trains are really nostalgic in American culture, right? The sound of a train, the rhythm of a train. It's the kind of, manifest destiny vanguard. And so that's probably why it's a train. There's no reason why. It could have been a bus, right, for all of it.
Well, there are nations that look to the future and nations that look to the past.
So that's very interesting, David, because, America is so future-oriented, except on this thing, right, which is where your education of these youngsters comes in, becomes so important, because if you are going to appeal to the past, you need to know what the past is accurately, right?
Yes.
Not some
yes.
configuration, not some fanciful weaving. Go back to those documents that you're sharing. And then, not only can you critique the past in its moment, but then you can subject this to the same critique. Is it reliably building on that documentary evidence that you're sharing with those students?
What would you tell that K through 12 reader that's preparing to come off to college, because it's so different than being in high school, right? And what's expected of you when you step into your college experience?
I'd stress the preeminent importance of context, right? So here's your letter, and it's written in 1776. And you can interrogate that letter on its own terms. But what does it mean in the larger context? What else was happening in 1776? And it's that context, I think, that historicizes the document.
If you can show a person how to read something in a new way, I've become fascinated with games, open world computer games that are really complicated, and you have to learn all sorts of different systems in order to succeed in the game, because it reminds me, going through this game, learning how to survive and not get killed by monsters or something like this, what it's like to learn something from scratch.
Yeah, to build the layers. Yeah, I think Mark's completely right that like what we do is context, right? Like I often get the sense that what goes on in high school is a lot of trivia rather than context. None of these documents will tell you like who Andrew Jackson's Secretary of State was. Like none of these documents like contain like trivia. But like if you piece them together, you get a story, right? And like that's what we're doing is like Like, what is the story that is revealed here?
Yeah, what a great project that would be. Here are your documents. Tell us the story that the documents tell. And don't be afraid of having holes, right? There are holes here, and that's okay. It's like the equivalent of that immediate gratification problem. People want it complete. And I'm not sure that complete is necessarily the same as truth,
Bingo.
right?
That's a good point. That's an excellent point.
But there are gamers who are completists.
To bring it back.
I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are many.
There's so many benefits to seeing the exhibit. One that strikes me is a really basic one, which is that the American Revolution happened here, right? It's associated with Boston and Philadelphia for like really important reasons. Like really key political events are happening in Boston and Philadelphia, but it also occurred in South Carolina. And so to see like the local, low country aspect of independence, I think is key, right? And also to remember that like Henry Lawrence wasn't like born with like a county named after him. Like Nathaniel Greene wasn't born with like a street named after him, right? Like these men had to do work, and you see certain aspects of like the work there.
When you go through the thing, the chronology shows an unsettled, uncertain beginning where things are contested and the meaning of stuff is still up for grabs. And the more you go in, what you see is this ramification of meaning, and all of a sudden there are all of these stories and narratives and pictures about the revolution which are sort of settled and stacked on one another, and it's got an increasing density.
Use this opportunity to engage with mixed media, be able to learn about this extraordinary historical event, make the connections between yesterday and today, and don't be afraid of the gaps, right? Explore the gaps, engage profoundly, and find your own answer, whatever that looks like, but don't forget to read, to be able to have that context and behind it to be able to tell your story and be able to tell that story authentically you, whatever that looks like.
Your question was, what do you gain by coming to see this exhibit? And I'm going to flip that and say, what do you lose by not coming? And you lose a lot. It's not that you need it, it's not essential to your world, but you're going to be impoverished if you don't come to see this. You'll be richer for the experience, for all the reasons that you enumerated, especially the holes, by the way. I think they're very important. But if you don't engage with this material, your understanding of the past is going to be thinner, less accurate, and frankly, less imaginative, right? This is an invitation to not just think about the past, but to fill the holes in. And then you'll ask your questions, hang on a minute, where do I go for those fillers? And then you go to the South Carolina Library, you go to the Department of Archives and History. In other words, your universe becomes a lot bigger by coming to see this exhibit.